But first, there's a big international custody battle brewing over a 5-year-old Cuban boy. Elian Gonzalez was rescued in the shark-infested waters off Florida after fleeing Cuba. It's an incredible story, but as Fox News Channel's Orlando Salinas reports, he may not get to stay very long.
The 5-year-old Cuban refugee on the stretcher has become the frenzied focus of an international tug-of-war. On Thanksgiving, after clinging for 2 days to an inner tube in the Florida Straits, Elian Gonzalez was found by a fisherman. Elian left Cuba with his mother and 11 others. Their target, American soil. But their makeshift boat overturned. 9 people died, including Elian's mother. A battle has now ensued over the boy's future home, featuring the United States, Cuba, the United Nations, a global trading group, a divided family, and a whole host of anti-Castro organizations.
These deaths represent more blood on Castro's hands. He is the one responsible for the misery on the island, and that's why people risk the very little that they have, their lives, to come and seek freedom and justice and liberty in these new lands.
Communist Cuba disagrees and began broadcasting its own statement over Cuban radio. The entire responsibility for these new and painful deaths fall on the government of the United States because of the senseless way that illegal immigration is promoted, stimulated, and rewarded from that country. In Miami, anti-Castro forces have elevated Elian Gonzalez to poster boy status, claiming the child's journey cuts to the heart of Castro's oppressive regime. Those forces, armed with their newly printed posters, are making their way to Seattle, joining other protesters at the World Trade Organization meeting going on this week. They hope their posters will persuade other governments from doing business with Cuba. Back in Miami, relatives want to raise Elian as their own. Elian's father, long separated from his mother, remains in Cuba and has asked the UN to help get his boy back.
I have done everything I can here. If I have to go and get him, I will. But he is going to be with me.
And Cuba is adding its voice to the fathers, demanding that the United States return Elian to Havana. The family in Miami says his mother died getting her son to freedom, and they will fight to keep him here in the U.S.
The standard is absolutely the interests of the child, not the best interest of the parents, not the best interests of governments, but the best interest of the child.
So Elian Gonzalez plays with his new family, unaware that while his flight to America was successful, his fight for freedom remains unclear. Orlando Salinas, Fox News.
So should the boy be allowed to stay in the United States, or should he be sent back to his father in communist Cuba? Joining us now from Miami, Florida Republican Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart, and in Washington, Dan is with us. He is the executive director of the Federation for American Immigration Reform. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Congressman, let me start by saying this once again proves, you know, first of all, how lucky we are, and I get some grief from conservatives sometimes. I just admire people that, as I say, get in these broken down, dilapidated, rickety boats in shark-infested waters or these inner tubes because they want the freedom that we sort of take for granted every day. And you have to admire their courage and their willingness to put their lives at risk like this, and it was a tragedy. That being said, this boy's natural father wants his son home. I have a 1-year-old son. I understand this father's plight. Putting all governments aside, I think the father has a right to his son.
Are you asking me that?
Yes, Mr. Balart.
Obviously, it's a very serious matter. The rights of the father always have to be given tremendous consideration and respect and dignity by any court. But I think that Mr. Ige, the lawyer for the family members here, is correct when he states that ultimately the best interests of the child have to be the guiding principle. And the reality of the matter is that that child's mother not only risked her life and the child's life, but gave her life so that her son would be free.
Here's the point. The father, I think in an instance like this, governments have got to be put aside. Look, no one is as staunch an anti-communist as yours truly or despises Fidel Castro as much as I do. But the fact is here, this father wants his son back. Yeah. And I can't see that not being in the best interest of the father, unless the information comes out that he was a bad father or something. He has a right to his son, and we've got to honor that.
Well, ultimately, in the United States, we do have the rule of law, and not like in communist Cuba, and so this is probably going to end up being decided by a judge. I do think that the judge is going to have to take as the primary guiding light and focal point of this situation the best interests of the child. And, you know, it's interesting. I was talking to the family yesterday.
Right.
Originally, the father was very happy with the fact that the child had survived and that it was here, and yet within 24 hours he's changed his story. So remember that at any time when you're talking about someone in Cuba,
reports about that, but all right, go ahead.
Yeah, anytime that you're talking about someone within Cuba, you cannot avoid at least the consideration of the coercion factor. This is a fellow who's in Cuba, who works in the tourism sector, in the apartheid economy. In other words, you know, the tourism enclaves are separated from the Cuban people.
Let's bring in Mr. Stein here. Mr. Stein, I'm Alan. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Alan.
Look, it's all well and good. The interests of the father certainly should be taken into consideration. What about the interests of the mother, who, as was pointed out, gave her life so her child might find freedom in America? And the fact that the child himself wants to stay here.
Well, I think, as we've already discussed here, a question of who's entitled to the child is one for both U.S. and Cuban law, with obviously a priority being given to, under normal conditions, the rights of a natural father to custody.
But are these normal conditions? Are these really? Is this really?
Well, these aren't. I mean, ultimately, these aren't normal conditions. And if we can step back for a minute and realize that this terrible tragedy, an awful situation, is unfortunately now being used for political purposes to try to raise a whole variety of issues which make this poor child a pawn. We have a national immigration policy that allows Cubans, if they get onto U.S. soil, essentially a green light to stay forever. And that has created an enormous black market in smuggling, of which apparently Alan's stepfather, the child's stepfather, was involved in alien smuggling. We see every day now boats hitting the beach from Cuba, Cubans trying to force their way past our Coast Guard.
Mr. Stein, but
and the Cuban government has made, I think, I hate to agree with the Cuban government on anything, but they are saying correctly that the United States, we have created the environment within which these tragedies are now occurring.
But you know, you make my point, because why punish the child that there's a stepfather that may have been involved in illegal activity? The child wants to be here. Why punish the child?
We're talking about a 5-year-old child. The question of whether this child actually is in a position to make an informed judgment is a legitimate issue.
We have more, Mr. Stein, on this. I don't want to cut you short here. We got to take a break. We'll throw it to you when we get back.
Coming up, his amazing journey caused a media frenzy. Now a young Cuban boy is the focus of an international custody battle.
Right now, we continue with Florida Republican Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart and Dan Stein of the Federation for American Immigration. Congressman, you know, the wishes of the mother who gave her life so her son might have a better life in America should be honored as well, especially given the fact that the child wants to stay here.
Yeah, and I think it's appalling that Mr. Stein said that the Cuban regime is right when it blames the United States for this tragedy. It must be very clear. The sole culprit of this tragedy in the Florida Straits and of thousands and thousands of others is the Cuban totalitarian nightmare. Before Castro took power and instituted a totalitarian state, in all former governments, during all former governments in Cuba, in good times, economically, and bad times, never once, not only was there not a raft or a death in the Florida Straits because of immigration, never once was the immigrant quota, the legal immigrant quota of the United States to Cuba filled.
Dan,
so,
also,
to blame the United States for
I
this.
would like to say that, look, I think Castro has been in power almost my entire lifetime. I believe, and FAIR believes, that if we had had a sensible refugee policy toward Cuba that encourages people who need temporary protection to work for positive change back home, to have temporary protection, would have been good, while encouraging people to stand and fight, to stay back to try to overthrow a dictator, would have made more sense than a policy
let's not get off topic here,
and let me say
hang on, we have very limited time.
To leave.
Congressman, I want to get, you mentioned the coercion factor. I think this is very important to bring up here. You say that, first of all, this is a very distant relative that they have in Miami, as I understand it. That's making it's a distant
first cousin of the father. First cousin of the father lives here.
All right, first cousin. But you know, I understand the coercion factor, and I think that's a legitimate issue, and probably who knows. But how can anyone doubt the sincerity of a father's love or desire to have his child so that he can raise his own son?
It would be my hope.
That crosses all political boundaries.
It would be my hope that the father and the relatives here could work out this case amicably in the best interest of the child. But I want to say the following.
Castro will never let him out. He'll never see his son again.
No, but I want to say the following. With regard to Cuba, anytime that we analyze the Cuban situation, and I want to say, because Mr. Stein talked about the policy we need to have towards Cuba,
But that's not the issue.
The issue is, let's have a policy towards Cuba that helps the Cuban people free themselves of communism, and then there won't be an immigration problem.
You're saying the government can step in here and some judge in Miami is going to rule and decide whether this boy ever sees his father again. And I don't think our government has any business deciding that. I think this father has rights that circumvent all political boundaries and has a right to see and raise his son.
It's not for our government to decide. It's for a judge in our rule of law to decide.
Dan Stein, Lincoln Diaz-Balart, thank you very much.